All right. So we've talked a little bit about archaeology and different ways of using archaeology. We'll do a little bit with that today and then go into some other things. But what I'm wanting you to see is not just the discoveries that I'm showing you, although that stuff's kind of interesting, but also be thinking about the process that, okay, they discovered some stuff in the ground that leads us to different applications and different things. Because really what I'm wanting you to see is how you can go back in and look at an archaeological discovery and pull information out of that to teach or to grow or to apply to your understanding of the Bible. And I'll give an example or two as we go, but really it's the process that's important, that it's not just going to a commentary, it's not just going to a study Bible or something like that, that there's a lot of other sources that you could go to find information about the Bible. So one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is they excavated the city of Babylon, and of course because when they're doing archaeological excavations, they tend to go very slow. So things like Hazor, they've been doing for years. Hazor was one of Joshua's major battles when the army went north. They kind of came through the middle and then went north into Hazor after they had done that middle area of Jericho and Ai. Gibeon was saved, and then they went north into Hazor, and then they had all of the southern campaigns. So they had kind of two campaigns going on. But anyways, Hazor they've been excavating for a long time. And so Babylon, who knows if they'll ever excavate all that, because when their initial excavations was 2,500 acres is how big the metropolitan area of Babylon was, right? So I want to say Jerusalem was more like 80 acres or something like that during David's time, some of that stuff. So we're talking about significantly larger kind of city. But there's some neat things that they discovered, that there was actually two areas to Babylon and a river that ran right through the middle. So just to kind of give you an overview of what the city itself is like, is there's this major river that runs right through the middle of it, and they built metropolitan areas on either side of the river, and they built a big bridge that went over it. And so that's kind of what Babylon itself was like, was this very large city, and then tributaries off of this river ended up becoming colonized and stuff like that. And one of these was the brook Chebar, coming off of this river, and that's where the Israelites, when they were deported, they ended up settling on a tributary of this main river, not necessarily right in the hub of the town. The deportees, many of them, the ones that weren't included in the kind of the palace, like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the major group of them was right in this area. And so that's kind of just something kind of interesting that archaeology kind of shows us, because the Bible doesn't really go into detail about what this city was like. Anybody know the one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world that was also in this city? During Nebuchadnezzar's time and right after him, they had one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world. One of the wonders of the ancient world that applies to the Bible is the Library at Alexandria. We've talked about that. But then one of the wonders was this one. It was called the Hanging Gardens. And we don't fully know what it was like, but it was this massive indoor forest garden that the Babylonian kings had created. So that's...
Where were they hung people?
Yeah. Anytime a tree was disobedient, it was hung in the Hanging Gardens. So that's just some neat stuff that adds to your overall understanding of kind of that world a little bit. So when you hear them talking about the brook Chebar, it makes a little more sense. Like, oh, okay, there's a major river running through that city, and it had these tributaries, so why not put the exiles along this so they have access to water, they're not becoming poor and dilapidated. They've got an area where they can get water and that kind of stuff, but we want to keep them just outside of the hub of the city also. Right? Okay. So let's go through a few other things. One other thing that archaeology kind of tells us is when they go through and they look at the cities that Israel conquered during Joshua's time, through Joshua, even into the period of the Judges, when they're doing these excavations of these biblical areas, they have come to a conclusion that almost all of them, what kind of terrain, if I was to ask you about the terrain that you might think would be common in the areas that Israel conquered, what kind of terrain would we be talking about? In fact, if I was to draw Jericho, Jericho was really in many ways kind of up against some high areas also. And so if I was to talk about the terrain, kind of give it away here, obviously it's the high country, right? The hills, mountainous areas. Jericho, Hazor, many of the areas that Israel conquered were all of the high areas. In fact, there's a story, probably should have looked it up, I believe it's Joshua 17.
So they never really got all the way to the Mediterranean.
Yeah, and not just the Mediterranean, but even within their individual inheritances, wherever there were large areas of open land, they often avoided that and left the Canaanite cities in those regions. It is Joshua 17. It's Joshua 17:14. It says, then the people of Joseph, right, so this is Ephraim and Manasseh, and this would be Ephraim and Manasseh on this side of the Jordan, on the west side here. So you had this area here is kind of how the allotment went on this side. So Reuben, Manasseh, Gad. And then over here, kind of Judah in this area, and then Ephraim, and then Manasseh. They were actually, the original inheritance lines were just straight across over into the Mediterranean so that everyone could get some territory. So they've got all of this area, but the only part that they conquered were the hill areas, and so there were large Canaanite cities that were in the valleys that they never conquered, right? So when it says that the Canaanites remained in the land, these were almost always valley cities that they didn't conquer. They only conquered the highlands in Joshua's exploits, right? So let's look at Joshua 17:14. It says, then the people of Joseph spoke to Joshua, saying, why have you given me but one lot and one portion as an inheritance, although I am a numerous people? Since all along the Lord has blessed me. And Joshua said to them, if you are a numerous people, go up by yourselves to the forest, and there clear ground for everyone in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, since the hill country of Ephraim is too narrow for you. And then the people of Joseph said, the hill country, notice what they're saying, the hill country is not enough for us. Yet all the Canaanites who dwell in the plain have, and this is why they never conquered any of these areas, chariots of iron. And it says, both those in Beth Shean and its villages, and those in the valley of Jezreel. Then Joshua said to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, you are a numerous people and have great power. You shall not have only one allotment, but the hill country shall be yours. For though it is a forest, you shall clear it and possess it to its farthest borders. For you shall drive out the Canaanites, though they have chariots of iron, and though they are strong. So he's trying to encourage them not to let there be areas in their allotment that they don't take, right? You know, and so they were fearful. Again, they fall back into this. So once they kind of had the main military campaign that kind of knocked out some of the major hill countries, then they divided the inheritances, and from then on out, they were operating primarily as tribes. And so then at that point, they often lacked the decisive leadership and the faithfulness needed to amass an army that was going to be able to dislodge these Canaanite cities that they were so fearful of. And so they just avoided them, essentially. They left these Canaanites in the land. All of the Philistine territory, that's all flat areas over here that were left unconquered. And then even, any areas over in this area that were flat, the Israelites often just avoided it because of this issue of the chariots. And so, knowing this, not only does the Bible say it, but then archaeology confirms it, that all of the cities that we can see that they destroyed seem to be in the hill country, right? So we can kind of verify this, and then that sheds light on the Bible story. And then the application, if you were going to teach this, would be that that after they stepped away from Joshua's courageous leadership, they fell right back into that same thing of only wanting to fight where they felt like they had an advantage. That they were unwilling to fight in an area that they felt they were disadvantaged at, because they would then have to be trusting in God to do it for them again. And it's very difficult for people. People are okay to enter into a fight. People are okay to trust the Lord for a mortgage loan if they can pay cash. You know what I'm saying? Everybody's fine then if they're paying cash. This is an example, but when they're doing it, a lot of times you see this tendency, not only in them but in us, that if we are trusting God for something that if He doesn't come through, we can't do it, then that's a whole different level of faith than trusting God to make something work out that we think we could do anyways, and just hopefully God will make it go smoothly. Right? So these hill country battles were things that they felt like we're not at a disadvantage. It's our soldiers against their soldiers. We've got as many people as they do. Technologically, we're on the same footing here in the hills. We don't mind fighting there. We're at a disadvantage in the valleys because they have chariots, and so the only way we can win there is if God gives us the victory. And so they were unwilling to do that in most cases. They were unwilling to take that step, and so they left many of those areas untaken. Right. So that's something that archaeology can kind of shed some light on. That even though Joshua is going through all the land, there's many, perhaps you could even say some of the best land is still left. Because the fields is where you're going to grow your crops. It's where your animals are going to be able to graze. Perhaps that's why you see Israel being more focused on sheep at this point than some of the other animals, because sheep can go right up on the hills, whereas some of the other animals do better in the plains. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it or not, but
Maybe that's why they had that.
yeah, and so you don't see them dominating those areas like the Lord would have wanted. So I think they left out a lot of their blessing because they were unwilling to take all of the inheritance.
They didn't have the darn technology, so David kind of needed. So
Yes, they couldn't do the chariots.
they had
So they didn't, so they had, apparently, during the time of Saul, the only sword was Saul and Jonathan's sword. Even into David's time, he had to flee to Nob, and the priest there at Nob, Ahimelech, gave David Goliath's sword, right? And he was able to use that. Because that type of technology was heavily guarded at the time. So they did have other things. They had spears. Saul threw his spear at David. So the spear technology was there, but the sword technology was not, and the chariot technology was not. And even later, it was only later that the Israelites adopted the chariots. It seems like what the Bible is saying is that even when David fought the Syrians who had chariots, that he didn't take their chariots. That he just destroyed them.
chariots are useless up in the mountains.
Yeah, and so in these hill areas, you can't do that. That's why, right here, where it is very flat, at the base of Nazareth and Megiddo, is what's called Armageddon. And what we call Armageddon is the base of the cities of Megiddo and Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, is that valley there. And this is where most of the enemies, when they wanted to fight Israel, would come and camp here so that they would have that advantage of being able to use their chariots. This is the area where the story is where Elijah is praying, and he says, I hear in my spirit the sound of the abundance of rain. And he goes and he tells Ahab to get down off the mountain and take his chariot back lest the rain stop you. What he's saying is if you won't be able to make it through the valley, if it's raining, your chariot will bog down and get stuck. When Israel fought one of their battles, I don't remember if it was Deborah or one of the other judges, they were fighting in this area, and God gave them the victory by raining and flooding the river that runs through there so that all of the land was mushy. And I believe it was Deborah, because I think it was Sisera, the general of those people, ended up having to flee because all of his chariots were stuck. And so they lost their advantage. And so the Lord delivered them by causing it to rain the day of the battle and causing that river there to overflood its banks. And so then they were able to overrun them, right? And so those are kind of things that cause the story to come alive when you understand the area a little better, right? And you understand some of those parts, right? And I would also then, if I was going to teach on that, compare the unwillingness of most of these tribes to enter in to places where they were at a disadvantage. I would compare that with the opposite attitude in David, that David is seen as going straight for the enemy's strongholds, right? So when he's fighting the Philistines the first time, he goes right after Goliath, their champion, right? Total disadvantage, and David was willing to go there. I think this is part of what God says when I'm after, David had a heart after my own heart, that everyone else is only wanting to fight where they are on even footing. David was willing to fight where he had a disadvantage because he knew God would come through. And so that was really the hallmark of most of the great leaders in the Bible, is that they were willing to trust God in places where they didn't have the advantage. And so David was that way. When David got ready to take a city, he didn't take places that were easy. He went right to the enemy stronghold at Jerusalem and decided, this is where I want to be. The place that everyone thought was impenetrable. The one city in the whole land that nobody thought could be taken, to where the inhabitants were leaning over the walls saying, even our crippled people will keep you out because there's no way that anybody can take this city. And David took the city. So David went right to the one place that seemed to be the greatest stronghold of the enemy and said, I'm going to start here. Same thing with Goliath. Went right to the greatest warrior of the Philistines and said, I'm going to start here. And so I think there is a comparison here between the attitude of the people who left all of these enemy in the land versus David. And the attitude is, I'm going to go to the place where I am at the greatest disadvantage, because when the Lord delivers me there, then the tables are turned. Because if the Lord delivers me in the place of their greatest advantage, then all of a sudden I've got victory right in their area, you know. And so that's kind of what David did. David went right to their greatest spot. God blessed him to be victorious there. And then from then on out, there was nothing left that the enemy could do, because David had taken that. It's the same attitude we see in Jesus when he says, if you're going to take someone's things, you have to first tie up the strong man, and then you can take his stuff. Jesus is saying that. So in other words, Jesus has the same attitude. He says, if I'm going to come and deliver people, I'm going after death and I'm going after Satan, because I'm going to take his stronghold first. You know, if I'm going to come here and I'm going to attack, I'm going to go right to the very heart of the enemy's strength. We'll start there. And so this same attitude that David had of, I'm going to take out the enemy's greatest stronghold, I'm going to take out the enemy's greatest fighter, is the same attitude that we see in Jesus when he comes and he tells them as much. He says, when you come, you've got to first bind the strong man. Yep.
Is there a place where you can go and research battle strategies? Like, say, a city where, like you were talking about, where a lot of battles took place.
Yeah, I think some of these you can. Although some of them we know.
Was it Shechem, the city of Shechem, where a lot of the battles?
Shechem was where Jacob lived, and Shechem is at the valley between the two mountains of Ebal and Gerizim, right? And Shechem is the valley in between those. Shechem is where Jacob sojourned until his sons killed all of the people in Shechem, and then they had to flee. So Shechem had some battles, but it wasn't nearly as battle tested as this area up here. So even when Deborah was living down here, they traveled up to this area because that's where the enemy stopped. The enemy was like, well, we'll just camp out here until you come fight us, because the enemy wanted to maintain their advantage. And so in terms of battle strategies, I think you'd have to take it city by city and kind of look,
So I was trying to figure out what might be the best city to research.
Right. Yeah, for battles. For battles, I would stay either in the north, up here. If you go west into this area, a lot of stuff was fought in Philistine areas. And then if you go east, out of Israel, over into this land, right on the border where Moab, Ammon, and Edom were, and then Midian and some of the other areas off to the side, the Syrians were over here. David fought some of his major battles right here. And so there's some of that in the wilderness. There's some neat places that David visited, but for the most part, they didn't do a lot of long-term battles down here because it was so dry. And then so in some of the battles here were one-time battles. Jericho, Ai, where once Israel got a foothold, they just kind of stayed in those regions.
Was that in this area over here where the Moabites were afraid of Israel because they had conquered so much land? The story of Balaam and Balak?
Balaam, yes. That's when Moses is coming through. Moses comes up from this area and is trying to go through their land to go over into here, which is modern-day Jordan. And in fact, Mount Nebo is right here. And that's where Moses went to see the promised land from the edge. And so these areas here were almost always enemy territory. But when David got ready to fight, that was often the places. David had some alliances with some of these people. David was friendly with Ammon for most of the time until the king of Ammon died and his son took over. And then his son, if you remember, shaved the beards off of David's people, cut their clothes in half, and made them go back naked, basically. So then David comes over here and fights this battle. And so then they get all of these people, which is the Syrians. The Syrians owned all of this area all the way back over into Mesopotamia. And so they were coming in, helping Ammon. And Joab comes over and is victorious. And so a couple of times Ammon hires the Syrians, and every time Joab and Abishi defeated them. David, in fact, wasn't even here for most of these. That was towards the end of David's life. They defeated them, and then after a while, the Syrians said, don't hire us anymore. We're going to leave them alone. And Syria kind of focused more back on that region. But those were big battles because there were so many of these people. And so Joab was unsure if they were even going to win. Joab split the army, if you remember, and said, all right, I'm going to take this half, and he sent his brother to take the other half. And he said, if one of us starts to lose, the other can come to their aid. But both sides won. And the Lord sent them on a flight. And then after that, Syria said, don't hire us anymore. We're going to stay on our side. And they never fought them again. And so, but by knowing the map, knowing the area, it helps you to get a lot more out of the stories because you have your context. And because otherwise there's so many names and so many places that the stories kind of run together.
So there should be research also in the Syrian literature and stuff about these battles that you can use?
I think so. I think if you went over to this area, there might be some archaeological discoveries. Question is are these governments over here actively engaging in letting people do research? You know what I'm saying? Israel is. If you wanted to do something, you know, if you remember some of the other classes, I had you go on to Israel's homepage, and then Israel gives a listing of every dig that's going on in the country, and you can go in there, and each one of those digs is being run independently by a different group, and they often have their own website. You can go on there and click. So like you could go to Hazor. They've been doing that for like 20 years. You can go into Hazor's dig site, click that, and they'll pull it up, and they have the dig reports for the last 20 years. What they found, what year range that was, because the deeper they go, the older they're getting. And so each year they know, okay, this year we're in the 8th century. Next year we'll be in the 9th century. And they know where they're at as they're going down. And they have reports, pictures of things they found, the maps that they're drawing based on what they know about that. So that's definitely a place where you could go and find out what's been researched in modern days. You know, so that would be.
On that other side, you have Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq,
Yeah.
Syria, on the part, so probably very little research.
Yeah, there's not nearly as much on this side, at least modern day research over here. There is the possibility that some of this area was dominated by larger empires that spread over into other places, particularly Babylon and Persia. And so their capital cities were in places that were not Iraq and Iran sometimes, and so, or they had major cities in some of these other areas. So we have some information from some of these areas, even though it wasn't taken directly out of the Middle Eastern part, because these empires grew so large. The Persian Empire was massive. This is Xerxes, Artaxerxes, from the book of Esther, which brings me to my next